The audience started a violent break in the middle of the show. John Lennon did this on the microphone, and the whole stadium froze. Detroit, Michigan. April 4th, 1968. Olympia Stadium. A fortress of brick and steel, rising from the industrial heart of a city that was still healing from the wounds of the previous summer. The riot of July 1967 had left Detroit scarred, in ways that went deeper than the burned buildings and broken windows. It had left a community divided, suspicious, carrying the particular weight of violence that had erupted between neighbors and had not yet found its resolution. 11 months later, the stadium was packed to its 15,000-person capacity for what had been announced as a John Lennon solo concert. Not the Beatles, not the Plastic Ono Band, just John, alone on stage, with an acoustic guitar and a collection of songs he had never performed publicly before. The audience that filled Olympia Stadium that April evening was unlike any that had gathered in Detroit since before the riots. Black families from the East Side sat in sections next to white families from the suburbs. College students who had been protesting the Vietnam War shared rows with factory workers who supported it. Teenagers who had grown up with the Beatles mixed with adults who considered rock music a symptom of everything that was wrong with American culture. It was, even before the first note was played, a volatile combination. The tension was visible in the spaces between people, in the way conversations stopped when strangers made eye contact, in the careful distance maintained between groups that, under different circumstances, would never have chosen to occupy the same space. But they were all there for the same reason. John Lennon, the man who had written All You Need Is Love and Come Together and Give Peace a Chance, the man who had spent the previous year making increasingly public statements about war, race, and the responsibility of artists to address the social upheaval that was tearing America apart. The man who had specifically requested that this concert take place in Detroit, in a venue that could hold the entire spectrum of the city's population. On a date that marked exactly 9 months since the riots that had left 43 people dead and entire neighborhoods in ruins. John walked onto the stage at 8 p.m. precisely. He wore jeans and a black t-shirt. No elaborate staging. No backup musicians, no anything except a single spotlight and an acoustic guitar that looked, against the vastness of Olympia Stadium, almost absurdly small. The applause that greeted his appearance was enthusiastic but uneven. Pockets of the stadium erupted while other sections remained conspicuously quiet. You could hear, in the quality of the sound, the divisions that existed within the audience, even before the music began. John sat down on a simple wooden stool at center stage. He adjusted his microphone. He looked out at 15,000 faces and seemed to take a moment to absorb what he was seeing. "Good evening, Detroit," he said, his Liverpool accent carrying clearly to the furthest reaches of the stadium. "Oh, I know this is complicated. All of us being here together like this, after everything that's happened." The stadium was completely quiet. "But here we are, and I've got some songs, and maybe by the end of the evening, we'll have figured something out." He began to play, a gentle finger-picked melody that most of the audience didn't recognize. A new song, written specifically for this evening, called Bridges. There's a river running through the middle of this town, and everyone's on one side or the other looking down, but water doesn't choose which bank it touches when it flows, and maybe that's the only thing worth knowing, that we know. The song lasted 4 minutes. The stadium listened in complete silence. When it ended, the applause was warmer, more unified than it had been for his entrance. For the next 45 minutes, and John played a set that moved carefully between familiar Beatles songs and new material. Here Comes the Sun. In My Life, Strawberry Fields Forever. Songs that had the power to remind a divided audience of what they shared rather than what separated them. It was working. The tension that had been visible when people entered the stadium was gradually dissolving into something that felt more like a concert and less like a potential confrontation. Until the fight started. Section 127, Row K, the seats 15 to 18. 4 young men, 2 black, 2 white, college age. They had been sitting together throughout the concert, apparently friends, sharing a flask, and singing along to the Beatles' songs with the easy camaraderie of people who were having a good time. Until John began playing Revolution. You say you want a revolution. Well, you know we all want to change the world. The song, released by the Beatles the previous summer, had become a lightning rod for political debate. To some listeners, it was an anthem for social change. To others, it was a dangerous endorsement of radical activism. To still others, it was a frustrating call for patience at a time when patience felt like complicity with injustice. During the second verse, one of the white students leaned over to one of the black students and said something that the people around them couldn't hear clearly, but they could see the reaction. The black student's face changed immediately. He stood up. He said something back, and his voice rising enough to be audible over John's singing. "Don't tell me about revolution, man. You don't know what revolution means." The white student stood up as well. "I know what it means to burn down your own neighborhood." The words carried in the acoustics of the stadium. People in surrounding rows turned to look. John, on stage, couldn't hear the specific exchange, but he could see the disturbance beginning in section 127. "And at least we're fighting for something," the black student shot back, "instead of just sitting in the suburbs talking about peace while other people do the dying." It escalated quickly after that. The way confrontations do when they're not really about the immediate disagreement, but about months or years of accumulated frustration that has been looking for an outlet. The 4 friends became 2 pairs of opponents. People in surrounding rows began choosing sides. Someone threw a cup, and someone else threw a program. Within 90 seconds, Section 127 had erupted into a brawl that involved at least 30 people. Security guards rushed toward the disturbance, but Olympia Stadium's security force, designed to handle ordinary concert disruptions, was not equipped to manage what was rapidly becoming a full-scale riot in the middle of a packed arena. The violence spread, section by section, row by row. The people who had nothing to do with the original argument found themselves caught in an expanding circle of chaos. Some tried to get away, others got pulled in. Many simply froze, unsure whether to run or stay, fight or hide. On stage, John stopped playing. He stood up from his stool. He could see what was happening. The careful equilibrium of the evening dissolving into exactly the kind of racial and cultural violence that Detroit had experienced 9 months earlier. The stadium security was overwhelmed. Police were being called. The house lights were coming up. People were screaming, pushing toward the exits, creating the conditions for a crowd crush that could kill dozens of people. 15,000 people, a divided city, the anniversary of a riot, and violence spreading through the stadium like fire through dry timber. John Lennon stood at the center of it all, holding an acoustic guitar that suddenly seemed completely inadequate for what was happening around him. But instead of leaving the stage, instead of waiting for security to restore order, instead of doing any of the things that a reasonable person might do in such circumstances, John Lennon made a decision that no one in Olympia Stadium could have anticipated. He walked to the edge of the stage. He stepped down into the audience, and he began walking directly towards section 127, where the violence had started and where it was now at its worst. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful, like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John Lennon walking through a rioting crowd with nothing but an acoustic guitar should have been suicide. Security experts would later describe it as the most dangerous decision they had ever witnessed a public figure make. A single man, recognizable to everyone present, and moving directly toward the center of a violent confrontation that had already injured dozens of people. But something extraordinary happened as John moved through the crowd. The fighting didn't stop immediately, but it began to shift. People who had been throwing punches noticed him walking past and stopped mid-swing. People who had been screaming at each other fell silent as they realized who was moving through their midst. John didn't try to break up individual fights. He didn't shout for order. He didn't do anything except walk steadily and calmly toward the section where the violence had begun, carrying his guitar and maintaining an expression of complete focus. He reached section 127 just as a security guard was trying unsuccessfully to separate two teenagers who were locked in a wrestling match that had already drawn blood from both participants. The guard was outnumbered, overwhelmed, and clearly losing control of the situation. John walked directly up to the two teenagers. He didn't touch them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, close enough that they couldn't avoid seeing him, and began to play his guitar. Quietly, a simple melody, the opening notes of Let It Be. The two teenagers stopped fighting, not because anyone had forced them to stop, but because John Lennon was standing 3 feet away from them, playing Let It Be in the middle of a riot. And the cognitive dissonance of that moment was so complete that physical violence became temporarily impossible to continue. Other people in section 127 noticed what was happening. The fighting began to pause as people turned to look at the surreal sight of the most famous musician in the world performing an intimate acoustic concert in the middle of a brawl. John continued playing, still quietly, but with the particular projection that comes from years of performing in large venues. His voice and carrying the melody of Let It Be without amplification became audible throughout the immediate area. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom. Let it be. The effect spread outward from section 127, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. People stopped fighting to listen. People stopped screaming to hear. The violence didn't end all at once, but it began to transform into something else. Curiosity, bewilderment, and the kind of attention that people give to something they've never seen before and don't understand, but find impossible to ignore. John finished Let It Be. The section around him was now completely quiet, but he could still hear fighting in other parts of the stadium. Violence that had spread beyond section 127 and was continuing in areas where people couldn't see what was happening where he stood. So he did something even more unprecedented than walking into the riot. He climbed onto a chair in row K, then onto the back of the row of chairs in front of him. Then, moving carefully but confidently, he began to make his way toward the highest point in section 127, using the stadium seating itself as a makeshift stage that would give him visibility throughout Olympia Stadium. People in section 127, both those who had been fighting and those who had been trying to escape the fighting, instinctively moved to help him, steadying the chairs as he climbed, creating a path for him to move upward through the seating, transforming from a rioting crowd into an impromptu technical crew supporting a performance that no one had planned and that defied every convention of concert production. John reached the highest accessible point, in section 127. He was now visible to most of the stadium. He sat down on the back of a chair, positioned his guitar, and looked out at 15,000 people, many of whom were still engaged in various forms of violent conflict. He didn't have a microphone. He didn't have amplification. He had nothing except his voice, his guitar, and the acoustic properties of a stadium that had been designed to carry sound from the stage to the furthest seats. He began to sing, not loudly, but with the particular clarity that comes from someone who knows that everything depends on being heard. Imagine there's no heaven. Imagine in 1968 was not yet the global anthem it would become. John had been working on the song for months, but it had never been performed publicly. Most of the people in Olympia Stadium were hearing it for the first time. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. The stadium's acoustics, designed to carry sound from the stage, were not optimized for a performance from section 127. But the building's architecture created an unexpected phenomenon. John's voice, projected from his elevated position in the seating, and bounced off the stadium's walls and ceiling in a way that distributed the sound more evenly throughout the space than a traditional stage performance would have achieved. People who had been fighting stopped to listen, not because they had made a conscious decision to stop fighting, but because the combination of John Lennon's unmistakable voice singing an unfamiliar song from an impossible location created a moment of such complete cognitive disruption that physical violence became temporarily irrelevant. Imagine all the people living for today. The song continued. Section by section, the violence in Olympia Stadium diminished. Not through any organized intervention by security or police, but through the simple, yet inexplicable power of 15,000 people gradually becoming aware that they were witnessing something that had never happened before and would probably never happen again. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion, too. By the second verse, large portions of the stadium were singing along, not with the organized enthusiasm of a typical concert audience, but with the tentative, wondering quality of people who are discovering a song as they sing it. People who had been throwing punches at each other 90 seconds earlier were now standing side by side, contributing their voices to a collective performance that no one had planned and that seemed to be creating itself. Imagine all the people living life in peace. The fighting had stopped completely. Throughout the stadium, 15,000 people, many of whom still carried the adrenaline and anger that had fueled the violence. They were now focused entirely on a single voice carrying a single song from an acoustic guitar positioned precariously on the back of a chair in section 127. John finished the second verse and paused. The stadium was completely silent, except for the residual echoes of the song bouncing off the walls. He looked out at the audience, taking in what had just happened, what was still happening. The transformation of a riot into something that had no name because it had never existed before. He began the final verse, but this time, instead of singing alone, he invited the audience to join him. "Come on, Detroit," he said, his voice carrying without amplification throughout the hushed stadium. "Let's imagine together. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. The sound that rose from Olympia Stadium during that final verse was unlike anything the building had ever contained. 15,000 voices, representing every demographic division that had been present when the evening began, singing in unison about a world without the boundaries that had nearly torn them apart an hour earlier. When the song ended, the silence that followed was complete. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so powerful that sound seemed inadequate to contain it. John climbed down from his improvised stage in section 127. People reached out to help him, to steady his descent, due to touch him briefly as he passed. Not the grabbing, desperate contact of fans trying to possess a celebrity, but the gentle, grateful touch of people acknowledging someone who had just done something for them that they would never be able to adequately repay. He made his way back to the actual stage, moving through an audience that parted for him with a reverence that had nothing to do with his fame and everything to do with what he had just accomplished. When he reached the stage, he sat back down on his stool. He positioned his guitar. He looked out at 15,000 people who were now completely, perfectly silent. And he said something that every person in Olympia Stadium would remember for the rest of their lives. John sat on his stool at center stage. Olympia Stadium was so quiet that his breathing was audible through the sound system. 15,000 people waited. He didn't speak immediately. He seemed to be considering what had just happened, what was still happening, what needed to be said about a moment that had no precedent and no adequate vocabulary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular quality of someone who is saying something true that he has never said before and may never have the opportunity to say again. I don't know what just happened here, he said. I mean, I know what happened, but I don't understand it. How fighting turned into singing. How anger turned into this. He gestured toward the audience, toward the stillness, toward the quality of attention that filled the stadium like a physical presence. But I think, he continued, I think what happened is that we remembered something we already knew but had forgotten, that we're more alike than we are different, that the things that divide us are smaller than the things that connect us. The stadium remained completely silent. The kind of silence that indicates not absence of response, but the presence of such intense listening that any sound would be a distraction. I came here tonight because Detroit has been through hell, because this whole country has been through hell, because we've been fighting about race and war and politics and everything else we can find to fight about. And I thought maybe music could help. Maybe music could remind us of something we've lost. John paused. He looked down at his guitar, and then back up at the audience. But what I learned tonight is that it's not the music that does it. It's not the songs. It's us. It's what happens when we stop trying to win arguments and start trying to understand each other. He stood up from his stool. He walked to the edge of the stage, close enough to the front rows that people could see his face clearly in the stage lights. 10 minutes ago, some of you were bleeding. Some of you were scared. Some of you were angry enough to hurt people you don't even know. And now you're here, together, listening, caring about the same thing. That didn't happen because I played a song. That happened because you chose it. You chose to stop fighting and start listening. You chose to remember that the person you were angry at is also the person who knows all the words to let it be. The audience was beginning to stir, not with restlessness, but with the energy of people who are recognizing something important and want to respond to it. I can't fix what's wrong with this country, John said. I can't end the war in Vietnam. I can't solve racism. I can't make poverty disappear. I'm just a guy with a guitar who got lucky enough to write some songs that people like. But you, he said, pointing directly at the audience, you can do something I can't do. Or you can go home to your neighborhoods and your families and your jobs and your schools and remember what happened here tonight. You can remember that it's possible for people who disagree to be in the same room without violence. You can remember that fighting is a choice, and so is not fighting. John walked back to his stool. He sat down. He positioned his guitar for one final song. This is for Detroit, he said. For everyone who's ever been told they can't change anything. For everyone who's ever felt like the problems are too big and they're too small. For everyone who believes that imagination is more powerful than hatred. He began to play Give Peace a Chance, but slowly, gently, as a lullaby rather than an anthem. All we are saying is give peace a chance. By the second repetition of the chorus, the entire stadium was singing. Not shouting, not chanting, but singing with the quiet intensity of people who have discovered something they didn't know they were looking for. The song continued for nearly 10 minutes. John would play a verse, and the audience would carry the chorus. No words except the ones in the song. No speeches, no explanations. No attempts to analyze or categorize what was happening. Just 15,000 people singing together about the possibility of peace in a world that seemed determined to make peace impossible. When it ended, John stood up. He bowed briefly to the audience. He said, "Thank you, Detroit," into the microphone, and then he walked off stage, leaving 15,000 people sitting in a silence that felt more like prayer than like the end of a concert. The audience didn't leave immediately. For nearly 20 minutes after John disappeared backstage, 15,000 people remained in their seats, not applauding, not calling for an encore, and not doing any of the things that audiences typically do at the conclusion of a performance. They sat. They looked at each other. They processed what had happened to them and what they had witnessed and what they had participated in. In section 127, where the violence had started, people who had been throwing punches an hour earlier were now talking quietly, introducing themselves, exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet for coffee, yet to continue conversations that had begun in the aftermath of their fighting. The 4 college students who had sparked the original confrontation were still there, still together, no longer divided into racial pairs, but reconstituted as a group of friends who had learned something about each other and about themselves that they hadn't known when the evening began. Marcus Williams, one of the black students, would later describe that conversation in an interview with the Detroit Free Press. "Well, we realized we were fighting about the same thing," he said. "We were all angry about injustice. We were all frustrated about how slow change was happening. We just had different ideas about what to do with that anger. And sitting there in those seats after what had just happened, we realized that fighting each other wasn't going to solve anything, that the people we were really angry at weren't in that stadium, that we had been turning our frustration with the system into anger at each other." David Morrison, one of the white students, added, "John Lennon didn't stop the fight by breaking it up. He stopped it by giving us something better to do with the energy we'd been using to hurt each other." When the audience finally began to leave Olympia Stadium, they left differently than they had arrived. The careful segregation that had been visible when people entered the building was gone. People walked out together, black families and white families, anti-war protesters and Vietnam veterans, college students and factory workers. Not because they had suddenly agreed about everything, but because they had discovered that disagreement didn't have to mean hostility, that it was possible to care about the same things while having different opinions about how to address them. The Detroit Police Department, which had been preparing for a major riot response, and found themselves with nothing to respond to. Officers who had been called to Olympia Stadium as backup arrived to find 15,000 people filing peacefully out of the building, many of them still humming "Give Peace a Chance." Captain Robert Hayes, who had been coordinating the police response, later told reporters, "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen anything like it. We got the call about a riot in progress, and by the time we arrived, we found 15,000 people acting like they'd just come out of church." The local media struggled to report on what had happened. How do you describe a riot that turned into a concert? How do you explain violence that was stopped not by force, but by a song? How do you categorize an evening that defied every existing framework for understanding crowd behavior? The Detroit Free Press ran the story on the front page with the headline, "Lennon Stops Riot with Song." But the article itself acknowledged that the headline didn't capture what had actually occurred, that something had happened in Olympia Stadium that was more complex and more significant than any brief newspaper account could convey. Rolling Stone magazine sent a reporter to Detroit to investigate. The resulting article, published 3 weeks later, was titled, "The Night Music Changed History." It included interviews with dozens of people who had been in the stadium, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. They had witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible: the transformation of collective violence into collective harmony through nothing more than one person's decision to walk toward the danger instead of away from it, and to respond to hatred with imagination. And John Lennon never performed "Imagine" at Olympia Stadium again. But the song, which he recorded and released 3 years later, carried within it the memory of that April evening in Detroit. The knowledge that it was possible for music to interrupt violence, that it was possible for imagination to be more powerful than anger. The people who were in Olympia Stadium that night carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives, and many described it as the moment when they learned that change was possible. Not through legislation or protests or political movements, though those things had their place, but through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to see the humanity in people they had been taught to consider enemies. Marcus Williams became a community organizer in Detroit. He spent 40 years working on racial reconciliation projects, always beginning his presentations with the same story: the night John Lennon walked into a riot and turned it into a choir. David Morrison became a teacher. He specialized in conflict resolution in urban schools. His classroom wall featured a framed photograph from that evening in Olympia Stadium, and he told the story to every class he taught for 35 years. Violence, he would tell his students, is what happens when people run out of imagination, when they can't think of any response to disagreement except force. What John Lennon did that night was give 15,000 people a different option. He showed us that there was something else we could do with our anger besides use it to hurt each other. Detroit itself changed after that evening. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in subtle ways that accumulated over time. The racial tensions that had exploded into riots the previous summer didn't disappear, but something had been demonstrated that hadn't existed before: proof that transformation was possible, that people who seemed destined to fight could choose to do something else. Community leaders began organizing events that deliberately brought together people who disagreed about important things. Olympia Stadium conversations, they called them. Opportunities for people to argue without violence, to express anger without hatred, to remember what they had learned about the possibility of change. On April 4th, 1969, exactly 1 year after the concert, at Detroit held the first annual Peace in the Stadium event. Olympia Stadium was filled again, this time with people who came specifically to practice the art of disagreement without destruction. Musicians performed, speakers talked about conflict resolution, and families shared meals with other families they had never met before. The event continued for 15 years, until Olympia Stadium was demolished in 1987. But by then, the idea had spread to other cities. The Olympia Stadium nights became shorthand for gatherings where people came together specifically to bridge differences rather than to widen them. John Lennon attended the 10th anniversary event in 1978. He performed Imagine Again from the stage this time for an audience that included hundreds of people who had been there for the original evening. When he finished the song, the stadium was silent for nearly 3 minutes, not because people didn't want to applaud, but because the moment felt too sacred for ordinary response. After John's murder in 1980, the Detroit event became a memorial as well as a celebration. People gathered not just to remember what had happened in 1968, but to commit to continuing the work that John had started that night. The work of choosing imagination over violence, of responding to hatred with music, of believing that change was possible even when every reasonable analysis suggested it wasn't. New Olympia Stadium was demolished in 1987, but a small plaque was installed in Hart Plaza, near downtown Detroit, marking the location where the stadium had stood. The plaque reads, "Here stood Olympia Stadium, where on April 4, 1968, John Lennon demonstrated that music is more powerful than violence, imagination is more dangerous than hatred, and one person's courage to walk toward conflict instead of away from it can change the world." Below that, us in smaller text, all we are saying is give peace a chance. Every year on April 4th, people gather at Hart Plaza to sing Imagine. Not because it solves anything, not because it changes policy or ends wars or eliminates injustice, but because on one night in 1968, 15,000 people learned that violence is a choice, and so is peace. And then sometimes all it takes to choose differently is someone brave enough to walk into the middle of a fight carrying nothing but a guitar and the absolute faith that music is stronger than hatred. That imagination is more powerful than fear. That the person throwing punches at you also knows all the words to let it be. The end. If this story about the courage to walk toward conflict instead of away from it, the power of choosing peace over violence, and the extraordinary grace of responding to hatred with music, moved you, subscribe, and leave that powerful like below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that violence is always a choice, and so is peace. What moment in your life taught you that imagination is more powerful than anger? Tell us in the comments below.